morning, everyone. My name is Wendong. I'm really glad to be joining you with the 2020 Virtual Crops TV. I'm an assistant professor and an extension economist at Iowa State University. I'm really happy to talk with you about today on U.S. China agricultural trade. I specifically chose the title to not only look at what we currently have in terms of the situation, but also looking forward, especially given that we have a change of government. So before I talk about the contents, I want to give you a brief introduction about myself. So I grew up in northern part of China, so knowing Chinese is probably my only advantage compared to my colleagues such as Chad Hart. And I got my PhD from Ohio State Ag Econ Department in 2015. I started working 1 month after that. And when I originally got hired, I actually was only hired mainly to do the Iowa Land Value Survey, which I will show you that the 2020 Land Value Survey results has just been announced this month. And you can find these results at this card.iastate.edu link/farmland. And at CARD, which is a Center for Agricultural Policy Analysis, in collaboration with ISU Extension and Outreach, we also co-founded the ISU China Ag Center in collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Ag Sciences, which a lot of the materials that I talk about can be found in this site as well. So before I talk about the U.S. China agricultural trade, I just wanted to give you a refresher, if you haven't read in the news yet, about what's going on with the Iowa farmland values. So the key numbers is at the bottom line. So as of November 1st, 2020, we're seeing about 1.7% growth in Iowa farmland values. Now the state average values stands as a little shy of $7,600 per acre. And when you're looking at across the crop reporting districts, only Southwest post a modest decline, 0.9% decline, where all the other 8 districts show a modest growth. 0 to 3% growth. Crop land quality, there are interesting differentiations that the high quality largely show probably flat patterns, and you will see greater declines. For example, eastern central, probably affected by the derecho in August, and low quality land show much stronger growth, 6.7% growth. I think in part is because that the COVID-19 pandemic probably made the recreational ground that can satisfy social distancing requirements more desirable, and also that it doesn't take much of the dollar amount change to post a higher percent change for a lower quality land. So how do you understand this modest 1.7% growth? If you're more optimistic, you will see that this is a third rise in the past 6 years and the second consecutive rise over the past few years. And however, the magnitude is fairly small. And if we look at the inflation adjusted numbers, it's a grow less than 1%. Okay. What are some of the driving factors that is pushing up the land markets despite the turbulent year that we have because of the pandemic, because of the derecho and the drought and the concerns, the impacts on livestock prices and ethanol prices. So the respondents, which are mainly agricultural professionals, noted a favorable interest rate, which is much lower due to Federal Reserve decisions to cut interest rate dramatically this March. Limited land supply, we're still in a tight land market. We still have really record level government payments, which also related to the ag trade discussion we talk about as well. But this is mainly in the form of COVID relief, in the form of CFAP payments, totals almost to $25 billion. As of now, that the Senate is actually discussing probably already passed a new gigantic coronavirus bills, which will further inject close to $9 to $10 billion more to farmers. So And a lot of you notice that the fourth factor, it is closely related to the U.S. China agricultural trade, is over the past few weeks and months, we have seen tremendous commodity price rallies that is almost unconventional for post-harvest seasons for both corn and soybeans. This is largely due to the surging exports to China. So I will unpack that a little more, but those are some of the factors. Remember that when you are thinking about the land market, land values equals income divided by interest rate. So those are some of the factors that are at play. So again, I mentioned that these two charts shows you that thanks to a record government payments depicted on the right, which stands at $46 billion at a record level, we saw about a $35 billion growth in U.S. farm income and the highest value since 2013 peak. So in other words, that the bulk of the growth in farm income is actually driven by government payments, not necessarily by dramatically improving fundamentals. So we are still, I don't think we are fully out of the woods in terms of the downward pressure posed by the pandemic yet. This is the commodity price rally I talked about, that largely thanks to surging exports to China, maybe some of the promising better than expected crop yields, especially nationwide. And when you are looking at these two charts, on the left is corn prices, on the right is soybean prices for the calendar year of 2020, you see almost an unconventional chart where if you listen to Chad, that typically he will tell you that the price rally often happens in April to early June, where you have the early harvest pre-planting rallies, spring rallies. And when you have a bounty crop, as we are having now, post-harvest, you tend to dampen the prices. However, we are seeing significant rises in prices we have never seen before in the past 3-4 years, and those are thanks to really surging exports to China. Likely we'll see a record level exports to China, in part thanks to the Phase 1 deal, but it's probably more importantly because China is still having pork shortage and also buying a lot of feed grains as they are rapidly rebuilding the hog herd after the African swine fever. Okay, so 2 more slides on land values. I will turn over to U.S. China agricultural trade. This map shows you where the hotspots are in terms of dollar per acre numbers. The highest dollar per acre county is still Scott County in a Quad City area, thanks to urban influence and proximity to Mississippi River watershed. And Adair County is still the lowest county. The Decatur County is still the lowest value counties in Iowa. And when you're looking at all the other red and orange counties, which has higher land values, that tends to be clustering in northwest Iowa and north central Iowa, which roughly coincide with the Des Moines-Loeb area with higher land qualities. Here is where the growths are. And of all the 99 counties, we see about 15 or so counties showing a decline, which is depicted in the yellow color. So which is more evident when you are seeing for example, the southwest counties, and the growth counties are often in northeast and south central counties, which is supported again by the significant surge by lower quality land, which often these districts tends to have more pasture and timber grounds as well. Okay, so when we are looking ahead, what the land markets might be doing a year from now and 5 years from now, these agricultural professionals typically forecast a stable land market when you are looking at a year from now, denoted in the blue. So the highest bar is no change, and maybe expecting a slight there's a split opinions in terms of whether we'll see modest growth or modest decline, but overall people are seeing a stable market over the next 12 months. When you are thinking about 5 years from now for 2025, land values, more people are expecting maybe the land market will see 5 to 10% higher values compared to the current value levels. So overall, that we are seeing more optimistic views towards the land markets, in part driven by the tremendous commodity prices we're seeing in the recent rallies. So shifting gears, and let's talk about some of the things that is driving the commodity prices, farm income, and agricultural exports. That is China. So when you are thinking about the situation we are in, we are having, it's good to take note to think about how the U.S. China agricultural trade is in a grand scheme of things in a broad theme of U.S. China relations. In normal crises, such as the Great Recessions and the financial crisis in 2008, typically bigger countries like U.S. and China join forces to think about how to solve and deal with the crisis and reboot the global economy. Unfortunately, this is not what's happening in this year. We are seeing a lot and quick deterioration of the bilateral relations, political relations, U.S.-China relations, in part due to the bickering over the origins and the best way of dealing with the the COVID-19 pandemic. And also we are seeing a lot more tensions in these two countries when it comes to national security issues, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea. And suddenly what is interesting is that in 2018, the sore point between these two countries was the trade issue, the trade war. Now suddenly the trade becomes one of the calming points in the U.S.-China relations, where the only remaining high-level talking channels is the communication regarding the implementation of the Phase 1 deal. Okay, so to remind you what the Phase 1 deal does, I have a November Ag Decision Maker article that talk about more about the U.S.-China agricultural trade relations, as well as how China is doing in terms of fulfilling these promises promised in the Phase 1 deal. I encourage you to check it out. There's a subscription there. On the chart, it shows you how the monthly U.S. agricultural exports to China looked like and how that compared with the Phase 1 deal target. Overall, that China promises to buy relative to the 2017 baseline. China promised to buy $12.5 billion more of agricultural exports from the U.S. In calendar year 2020 and $19.5 billion more in calendar year 2021. Even though we already have a change of government, likely the Biden administration won't have time to put the renegotiation of the trade deals with other countries, including China, as a top priority. So we likely will see those Phase 1 deal actually maintained. So this still is very important, where when you are looking at this chart, the black dashed line shows you the prorated monthly targets. I have to remind you that the Phase 1 deal actually only give you annual targets. So this is just for heuristic purposes. And the baseline is showing in essentially the green line here, which is a 2017 baseline. And the other line you should pay attention is the red line, which is 2020. So first, if you look at the January to March lines, the red line is much lower compared to the green line. This is because of the COVID-19 pandemic. When China was battling with the coronavirus, their ability to buy products from the U.S. was hindered, and that is shown in the data. There's a significant gap between that with the baseline. However, the pace has been growing rapidly and is blowing all historical records. In October 2020, we actually saw the highest record level exports in total for U.S. agricultural products to China. However, if you lay against the red line to the black dashed line, which is the phase one target, they're still below the October target, right? So they are, when you are thinking about how lofty these goals are, they are pretty significant. Typically, China buys from the U.S. In a magnitude about $20 to $25 billion annually. And China, essentially in a phase one deal, promised to buy close to $35 billion compared to $20 to $25 billion. So now when you are thinking about the predictions, we, my colleague Derma Hayes and postdoc Xi He we have done analysis, we have forecasted how the 2020 exports to China might be, and we predict that China likely will buy about $31 billion in total. And if you compare with the benchmark, it's much higher than the 2017 benchmark. If this $31 billion is realized, this will be the record year for U.S. agricultural exports. However, this is still below the target based on the phase one deal. So one of the interesting things to see, and that potentially could affect the commodity prices in the first half of next year, is that if we do a meeting and a sort of a performance review of U.S.-China trade, and we likely will find that China probably will still be somewhat below the target for agricultural purchases, and the energy target will be even larger gap. And to the extent that there will be some actions as a result of that, then that could be negatively impacting the commodity markets. What is also interesting in this chart is that you can see that the soybean prices as the soybean exports is roughly comparable to the baseline, stands at about $11 to $12 billion, but we have seen record exports in pork, beef, and corn, so to China. Right, so those are almost never seen before. This is mainly driven by China still about 10% short in terms of inventory. They have essentially lost about 40% of the inventory through the African swine fever. They have, through dramatic financial subsidies and rebuilding efforts, they have now been about still 10% short. Likely they will rebuild to the pre-African swine fever level next year. But in the meantime, the domestic Chinese corn prices is really high, and they're still having meat shortages with pork and beef. And one of the major competitors was the U.S. Germany is also battling with African swine fever as well, which all these led to really record level exports in terms of corn, pork, and beef. Right. So given that China won't be able to reach their desired pork production level until next year, over the next year, we will still see really strong pork and beef and potentially feed grain exports to China as well. So one of the things that this is similar to the charts is when you are thinking about what are some of the other products that we're buying from China is buying from the U.S., that we should pay attention to soybeans, but I would argue that we should also pay attention to other commodities. This chart shows you that for all the agricultural commodities, what China is buying from the U.S. and other countries. Right. So the top line here shows you for soybeans, China buys about $12 billion from the U.S. and buys even more from other countries, mainly from Brazil and Argentina. When you see yellow colors in other commodities, that means China buys these products from the U.S. for these products. Right. So China buys some forest products, some hide and skins. However, you don't see a whole lot of yellow in other commodities. That's exactly that I would argue that there are significant readjustment opportunities for us to have a more balanced pathways and portfolios, to have a stronger representation of proteins, beef, pork, poultry to China, as well as consumer-oriented products, the fruits, vegetables, wine, infant formula, and things like those. There are some unique factors due to the COVID-19 that affected, for example, the fruits and vegetable and potentially could affect even the protein exports. Is because that China recently has frequently detected the presence of coronavirus in the packaging of the frozen products that is imported from foreign countries, including pork and especially seafood and vegetables. So they are becoming a little more concerned and hesitant in these imports. So that potentially could be one of the risk factor. But when you are thinking about the longer term potential, those are some of the things that we can really make a stronger push for U.S. products, because China is buying from other countries, and U.S. also have similar products, if not better quality. Right. So Purdue University has an Ag Economy Barometer, which talk about what the farmers think about these trade deals. On the left, it shows you the percent of people who are saying that China will likely be meeting the phase one agricultural imports targets. You can see that the gray bar is the highest in terms of likely people who say that China will likely meet the goal, which is around half, right? So there are split opinions, and after the election, showing the yellow bar, people are a little more uncertain because there are perceived uncertainties regarding the new Biden administration's policy and priorities. On the right, however, that shows there are eternally optimistic view among the farmers, thinking about that overall the trade dispute will ultimately be resolved in a way that will benefit the U.S. agriculture. Right. So what is also interesting is over the past 2 months, before and after the election. So before the election is the gray bar, and after the election in November is showing in a yellowish bar. Is how farmers think the expectations regarding key policies that is related to the change of government, right? So a lot more people worry about tightening environmental regulations, potential increase in estate tax. Maybe there are some concerns about decreased subsidies for ethanol industry, and maybe and a weaker farm income safety nets, right? So there are some concerns about taxes and environmental regulations. We'll see how these priorities play out. When it comes to trade policy, I also have my own conjectures as well. The first thing I want to do is I probably want to lower your expectations on the tariff rollbacks. Is that although that the President-elect Biden talk about that he doesn't like the tariff approach, but I think that the political landscape has created a fundamental shift in our approach dealing with China. Now China is essentially treated as a strategic competitor with the U.S., so likely we will still see a remain tough stance among the top officials, and the trade policy likely won't be a super high priority, especially for the first year and a half. When COVID-19 responses and the Paris Accord on climate change probably will take a higher priority. When you also think about the general approach, we can also see that likely we'll see a different approach in dealing with China. We'll see probably a resumption of more normal dialogue channels that hasn't been seen over the past few years. And the tone will be more measured and polite. And President-elect Biden will likely be trying to involve multilateral allies in dealing with China, which has pros and cons, right? So if we have a concerted effort voice, then that has more meaningful outcome, can change behavior for China. But also that when you are looking at what China is doing in the global arena, China is also making strong retaliations against our allies, for example, Australia. So there likely will be differences in the opinions and approaches dealing with China among U.S. allies, which how concerted these voices will be and remains to be seen. One of the interesting things that might occur and has higher likelihood because of recent events is the President Biden administration is more likely to reconsider rejoining the TPP trade agreement, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So which, from agricultural standpoint, this will be a great deal for U.S. agricultural exports. So what is the trigger is that China and 10 Southeastern Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, just signed a trade pact called RCEP, Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, which now has really triggered the consideration, and especially China now is signaling that China want to join the CPTPP that U.S. pulled out as well. So there are a couple of things to watch in the trade policy arena. One of the things I want to mention is that President-elect Biden is no stranger to Chinese President Xi. He actually was the one who accompanied President Xi visiting Muscatine in 2012 when both of them were vice presidents. And he also was the Foreign Affairs Committee chairs in the Senate in 2001 when China joined WTO. And he just recently assigned several new posts that you can see the flavor of how the agricultural and trade policy might shape. On the left, it shows you his pick for the U.S. trade representative who will be likely be negotiating on the trade deals, including China, right? And it's a Catherine Tai. So her parents came from Taiwan, so she actually understands Chinese as well and taught English in Guangzhou, China for 2 years. And he is known as one of the China critic and really knows the trade laws, so likely we won't see a sudden shift in the policies in terms of how do we deal with China's trade practices, right? So one of the things that we're familiar with the high-level appointments are the former Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack and former USDA Secretary is now announced to be the next Agriculture Secretary again. And at the bottom, there's Seth Meyer, who is the ISU alumni from our department, actually, will be the USDA chief economist. So at least I think we'll see familiar faces in the administration, and we can definitely guarantee that the Iowa and Midwestern farmers' voices will be heard in these negotiations. So broadly, when you're thinking about why we care about the Chinese market, I would argue when you go back to this commodity charts I showed you earlier, for example here, that you can see that the commodity rallies that is driven by surging exports to China. This shows in this era of the pandemic the indispensable nature of U.S.-China agricultural trade. And this is a bilateral and a two-way street because that from U.S. perspective, the Chinese demand is really significant in shaping commodity prices and farm income. From China's perspective, they really need the commodities, for example, the pork, beef, and corn for the rebuilding hog herd because they're really battling with significant gap in because of African swine fever. Right. So moving ahead and thinking about what the future economic growths are, and that likely will drive the future global demand because 20% of the agricultural products from the U.S. will actually be sold to global market, and China stands out really this year as the only major economy that will post about 2% growth, positive growth, in contrast with the U.S. about 3.7% decline in GDP for 2020. And China will likely grow 8% next year and 5% for the next decade. So we will see still really robust growth. To give you some perspective, the 5% growth of the Chinese economy is the size of Australia, the size of the Australian economy. So those are really significant numbers. That's why that when you're thinking about the global customers that is increasingly buying agricultural products from the U.S., China is one of the important and major one, right? So there are several news from China I want to alert you. The top story is about China's mentioning a new approach called the dual circulation. So it's really hard to understand, but you can think of this as a dual cycle in the economic growth where China is saying that there is a cycle of international economy involving China, both in terms of imports and mainly they're thinking about exports, right? So they're mainly thinking about how Chinese economy is driven by exports to other countries, by the way, is actually looking at record levels because other countries hidden by the coronavirus lack the ability to export, so China actually are taking much higher shares. So this news signals that China's long-standing position and probably nudged and accelerated by the trade war with the U.S. that China want to be more self-reliant and strategically relying on less on foreigners, especially the U.S. Right. So that's why I also think that we shouldn't only relying on China buying more and more soybean exports from the U.S. because China is already buying 60% before the trade war. Likely it will decline rather than increase. The other two stories talk about China now halted the ethanol mandate that's supposed to be in place in this year. And that also is becoming a further hurdle because the COVID-19 limited the percent of the driving, the miles that people will drive. However, China recently just pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060. And I think that ethanol is one part of the major renewable energy portfolio that China pursues as a longer-term strategy. So I think that the ethanol blending plans, the ethanol mandate will still be revived in the medium future, right? So again, here is more discussions on what is RCEP and CPTPP. So in general, that China and the Asian countries, along with Australia and New Zealand, created one of the largest trade pact in the world, measured by the size of the economy, which give incentive for the U.S. potentially to consider rejoining the TPP. Now, without U.S., it's called CPTPP. Okay, so there are also more changing tones in U.S. Foreign policies that you could likely see even with the change of administration. We probably won't necessarily see a dramatic improvement in U.S.-China relations. I think there is a structural shift in terms of how both countries view each other, especially how U.S. political and business leadership views about China, mainly as a strategic competitor. But the foreign minister of China calls for a return to restart dialogue, rebuild trust, and return on a right track. You could see there could be more coordination in how do we jumpstart the global economy, how to distributes the COVID-19 vaccines fairly? How do we deal with climate change? Because it's part of the Paris Accord, and potentially U.S. will be reconsidering the Iran deal, which China is a stakeholder in there as well, right? So there might be more collaboration and normal dialogues between these two countries, but I think the fundamentals have shifted. So another thing I want to mention is when you are thinking about, despite the great news in this 2020 exports to China, there is a significant diversification that has occurred before the trade war. And the orange line shows you the share of the Chinese agricultural imports that is coming from the U.S. And since 2012, which is the year of President Xi took office, has gradually declined significantly over time. And you can also see that soybean imports from Brazil also hit record level as in part the Brazilian currency depreciated 20% because of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So we likely will still see the continuation of China's strategic diversification away from the U.S., even with the change of administration, right? So one way to diversify is through the mechanism called the Belt and Road Initiative, which can make the European exports to China cut in the transport time from close to 2 months to 3 weeks, right? Especially for the higher value products, and those are really utilizing these railroads highlighted in this map, right? So I want to take the last few minutes to talk about more longer term why we should care about China and why China is one of the still indispensable market for the U.S. And one of the way is that because when you are just look at the China's perspective, China, this is the Chinese map lower overlaying with the lower 48 states with my hometown highlighted as a similar latitude as Kansas. And roughly, China has the same land area as the United States. However, when you are looking at on the western portion of China, is Tibet and a bunch of deserts. So it's really inhabitable for crops, animals, and people. So where people live is in the cyclone-colored area where over 90% of the people live in these areas. That's 90% of the 1.4 billion people fighting for the limited arable land with animals and crops. So if you think about that, China only have about 7 to 9% of the arable land, but 20% of the global population, where the U.S. ratio is 4% of the global population and 15% of the arable land. That's why that commodity agriculture is comparative advantage for the U.S., but not necessarily China, especially for the land-intensive feed grains and proteins. Right. So I mentioned that my hometown area is in the same latitude as Kansas. However, that the thousands of years of transition from corn and corn and wheat productions have shifted to vegetable production in greenhouses. On the left, it shows you my uncle holding his grandson. On the right, it shows you during the after the COVID-19 pandemic in China, where my county official head is promoting on the mobile platforms the vegetables from my home counties because now 500 million people shop online in China using the mobile phones. Right? So there are some other things that are fundamental why we need to care about China, because overall Chinese meat consumption depicted on the left, our per capita meat consumption are still rising in contrast with the U.S., which is staying flat. And we likely could see some downside risk in 2020 for the pork exports, for example, because China regards pork as a strategic commodity where they aim to produce 97% domestically. However, I think we could potentially make gains for other meats like beef And consumer products like cherry, like this Chilean cherry, is gaining popularity significantly, along with avocados. And this just shows you with the growing income that Chinese people are eating more meat. And when you're looking ahead over the next decade, China is expected to have another 350 million people who enter the middle class, which is earning about 20,000 US dollars pre-tax. Right? So I've talked about African swine fever before, so I will skip this. But in general now, China is still 10 to 15% less compared to the hog inventory, but they aim to close the gap next year. So following that, in 2022, we might see some slowdown in terms of exports to China. What is also interesting is in these charts is you are seeing more and more Chinese are eating outside, showing the green charts. And on the right, it shows you the exports of avocados to all different countries. At the right bottom is China. There's growing from 0 to almost like 100 times more compared to 10 years ago. That shows you with the higher income, there's more people demanding for higher quality products and higher quality that can be differentiated for that you immediately can tell this is an imported products as well. Right? So I've talked about this before. So one of the last slides I have is that you need to bear in mind that China is a country of rapid change. I give you one non-ag example of high-speed rail that for 10 years ago, when I graduated from my undergraduate college, it took 11 hours to go from my state capital to Shanghai. Now the same route with the high-speed rail takes less than 4 hours. On the right, it shows you that there are some new entrepreneurship in China. This is one of the new companies which they're making agricultural drones to do pesticide spraying. I included one of the short YouTube video for you to watch as well, where even though Chinese field size is only 1 to 2 acres, but sometimes the township coordinate, so these drones can fly thousands of farmers' fields to save pesticide application cost, and also you can provide more variable rate applications in those as well. And a lot of those entrepreneurs went to the U.S. and Europe for study before they returned to China, right? So in the end, I want to mention some of the phrases I talked about before. That on the left, it shows you the two Chinese phrases that symbolic of the both positive and somewhat contentious view of the United States among the Chinese public, where the shorter phrase is 美国, which is the name of the USA, literally translated into a beautiful country, symbolic of the general positive tone of the general public when thinking about the United States. However, the next phrase is also true, which is 中华民族伟大复兴, which roughly translate into the grand rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which, if I borrow one U.S. political jargon, roughly make China great again. Right? Okay, I have some recommended books for you to learn more about the Chinese economy and U.S. China relations and the lives of the Chinese people in these transitions. That is unseen the thousands of years of the history in China, but also some information sources, including the ISU's Ag Decision Maker, which I want to remind you that we actually will have monthly free webinars for you to listen to for key farm management issues as well. You can go to Ag Decision Maker, Google that, and with ISU extension. And if you want to find more information about the land value markets and the research related to the phase 1 deal African swine fever, you can go to the CARD website, which has a ISU Farmland portal and ISU China X Center. Feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you very much for your time. And I understand 2 days later will be the new year. I wish you had a wonderful Christmas and you will have a happy and prosperous 2021. Thank you.